The steel door slides open. 23 hours of silence ends. For the next 60 minutes, Valdez walks into what correction officers call the most dangerous 60 minutes in American corrections. PelicanBay State Prison, Del Norte County, California. The yard where men spend 22 hours in solitary confinement, then release their rage in a concrete cage surrounded by gunmen. Between 1989 and 1995, this prison recorded over 1,000 violent incidents. Stabbings, beatings, riots that required lethal force to stop. The security housing unit wasn't designed to rehabilitate. According to federal court testimony, it was designed to break. In 1995, U.S. District Judge Thelton Henderson ruled that conditions here violated the Eighth Amendment. But the violence didn't stop. Because at PelicanBay, the yard isn't a privilege. It's a gladiator pit. And every man who enters knows one truth. Show weakness once, and you'll never leave that concrete alive. This is the story of America's first Supermax, where isolation meets violence, where gang validation can bury you for decades, and where the most dangerous yard in America operates under one rule. Survive the hour, or don't survive at all. The cage that broke men. The year was 1989. California had a problem it couldn't ignore anymore. Prisons were overflowing. Gang violence was spreading like infection through the system, and the state needed somewhere to put the men it considered the most dangerous humans alive. Del Norte County, Northern California, one of the most remote locations in the state. Surrounded by dense redwood forests and fog, miles from the nearest town, they built PelicanBay State Prison here on purpose. Away from everything, away from everyone. The security housing unit was the centerpiece, a Supermax facility housed inside a maximum security prison. The concept was simple. Take the most violent gang leaders, the most dangerous inmates in the entire California system. Strip everything away. No television, no radio, no contact with other prisoners, no windows, no sunlight. 23 hours a day inside a concrete box measuring 8 feet by 10 feet. The only break was 1 hour of solitary exercise in a small concrete yard. Alone, surrounded by walls so high you could barely see the sky above. The California Department of Corrections called it a management tool, a way to neutralize gang leadership from the inside. If you could isolate the leaders, the theory went, you could dismantle the entire organization. On paper, it made sense. In reality, something far darker was happening inside those walls. The first inmates arrived in December 1989. Within months, corrections officers began documenting something disturbing. Men who had entered the SHU calm and collected were deteriorating rapidly. Some stopped eating entirely. Others began talking to walls. Several inmates developed what psychologists would later describe as SHU syndrome, a condition directly linked to prolonged isolation. Hallucinations, catatonia, psychotic breaks, self-mutilation. According to testimony presented during the landmark federal lawsuit MadridVGomez, some inmates have been held in the SHU for years, not months, years, without meaningful human contact, without adequate mental health care, without any pathway to release back into general population. Dr. Craig Haney, a psychologist who testified during the trial, described what he found inside PelicanBay as devastating. Men who had spent extended periods in isolation showed signs of psychological damage that would take years to repair. Some would never fully recover. But the violence, that was the other side of this equation. Because when the state built a cage designed to break men psychologically, they simultaneously created something else entirely. A pressure cooker. And every single day, for exactly 60 minutes, the lid was lifted. The yard. That single hour of exercise was supposed to be a privilege, a brief reprieve from the crushing isolation of solitary confinement. But inside PelicanBay's SHU yards, it became something else entirely. It became the moment everything exploded. Gang rivalries that had been festering for months inside isolated cells erupted the second men stepped into that concrete cage. Corrections officers reported that stabbings could happen within the first 30 seconds of yard time, before any officer could even react. The weapons were improvised. Sharpened pencils, broken pieces of plastic, metal fragments torn from fixtures. In an environment where inmates had almost nothing, they found ways to create killing tools from the smallest objects imaginable. And because the yards were so small and so enclosed, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. When violence erupted, it erupted fast. And it was brutal. Between 1989 and 1995, PelicanBay documented over 1,000 violent incidents across the facility. Stabbings became so frequent that corrections officers developed specific protocols for responding to yard violence. But even with armed guards and elevated towers overlooking every yard, stopping a stabbing that happens in 2 seconds was nearly impossible. The state had built a machine. Feed dangerous men into isolation. Strip away everything that makes humans human. Then release them into a concrete box for 60 minutes. And wonder why they tried to kill each other. By the early 1990s, human rights organizations were already raising alarms. The American Civil Liberties Union, the Prisoner Rights Project, legal advocates across the country were gathering testimony from former inmates and corrections officers who described conditions that shocked even seasoned legal professionals. The stage was being set for the biggest prison lawsuit in American history. But that fight was still ahead. For now, inside the SHU, the yard remained exactly what it had always been since the day those first steel doors opened. A gladiator pit disguised as an exercise yard. The gang validation machine. Inside PelicanBay, survival wasn't random. It was organized. And the organization that controlled who lived and who died inside those concrete yards operated with military precision. The gangs. California's prison system had been dealing with gang violence for decades before PelicanBay opened. But the security housing unit created something new. It concentrated the most powerful gang leaders in one location, stripped away everything else, and left only the gang structure as the single organizing force in every inmate's life. The Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, the Black Guerrilla Family. These weren't street gangs anymore inside PelicanBay. They were survival networks, and membership wasn't optional. According to court documents from MadridVGomez and subsequent investigations, inmates who refused to align with any gang faced a brutal choice. Walk into the yard unprotected, or stay inside their cell and refuse yard time entirely. Refusing yard time meant adding more isolation to an already crushing existence. Walking out unprotected meant becoming a target. The California Department of Corrections had its own system for tracking gang membership. They called it gang validation. Gang validation was the process by which the department officially classified an inmate as an active gang member. Once validated, an inmate could be placed in the SHU indefinitely, not because they committed a specific violent act, but because the state had determined they were affiliated with a dangerous organization. The evidence required for validation was disturbingly thin. According to testimony from former corrections officers and legal advocates, validation could be based on tattoos alone. A single photograph, a letter found in a cell that mentioned gang terminology, associates who were already validated. Once validated, an inmate could remain in the SHU for years, decades in some cases, with no clear pathway to release, no specific crime to appeal, no definitive sentence, just indefinite isolation based on affiliation. Human rights organizations documented cases where inmates had been held in the SHU for over 15 years based on validation alone. Some had never committed a violent act inside the prison. They were locked away not for what they did, but for what the state believed they represented. The validation system created a cycle that fed directly into yard violence. New inmates arrived at PelicanBay. They were immediately assessed for gang affiliation. If they showed any connection, a tattoo, a known associate, a piece of correspondence, they were validated and placed in the SHU. Once inside the SHU, the only social structure available was the gang itself. The gang provided protection during yard time, information about which inmates were enemies, directions on who to attack and when, and the attacks were coordinated. According to corrections officer testimony documented in court proceedings, yard violence at PelicanBay was rarely spontaneous. It was planned, sometimes days in advance. Inmates communicated through coded messages passed between cells. through trusted intermediaries during the brief moments of contact that existed, through systems so sophisticated that corrections officers struggled to intercept them. A gang leader sitting in isolation for 23 hours could still direct operations, still order attacks, still control the flow of violence inside the SHU yards. The isolation was supposed to neutralize these leaders. Instead, it made them more focused, more strategic, more dangerous. The Mexican mafia in particular maintained extraordinary control inside PelicanBay. According to multiple documented accounts, the organization operated with a clear chain of command even inside the SHU. Leaders communicated through what corrections officers called kites, handwritten messages carefully folded and passed through elaborate distribution networks. These kites contained everything: orders for attacks, instructions for new recruits, updates on rivalries and alliances, strategic planning for operations both inside and outside the prison walls. The California Department of Corrections attempted to intercept these communications. Mail was searched, cells were raided, but the networks were too sophisticated, too deeply embedded in the fabric of inmate life inside the SHU. And so the violence continued. Organized, directed, calculated. Outside the prison walls, the legal system was beginning to pay attention. Lawyers from the Prisoner Rights Project had been gathering testimony for years. Former inmates who described the psychological devastation of SHU isolation. Corrections officers who admitted that the system was failing. Mental health professionals who documented the growing crisis inside PelicanBay. Their case was building. Slowly, methodically, and it would eventually reach a federal courtroom where a single judge would look at the evidence and declare that what was happening inside PelicanBay violated the United States Constitution. But that moment was still ahead. For now, inside the concrete yards of the security housing unit, the machine kept running. Every day, like clockwork, steel doors opening, men stepping into the cage, gangs directing the violence, and corrections officers watching from elevated towers as the system they had built continued to produce exactly what it was designed to contain. More violence, more chaos, more bloodshed. The yard at PelicanBay wasn't failing. It was working exactly as the pressure had built it to work. And somewhere inside that system, a federal judge was already asking questions that would shake the entire California prison system to its foundation. MadridVGomez, the trial that shook America. The evidence had been building for years. Whispered testimonies from former inmates, corrections officers who couldn't sleep at night, mental health professionals who walked out of PelicanBay shaken to their core, and a legal team that had been quietly assembling the most damning case against an American prison system in modern history. The case was called MadridVGomez, and when it finally reached the federal courtroom of U.S. District Judge Thelton Henderson in San Francisco, everything changed. The lawsuit was filed by the Prisoner Rights Project on behalf of a class of inmates housed in the security housing unit at PelicanBay. The central argument was devastating in its simplicity. The state of California was inflicting cruel and unusual punishment on human beings. Not through beatings, not through executions, but through a system so psychologically destructive that it was literally driving men insane. The Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. That was the foundation of everything that followed. The trial began in 1994, and from the very first day, the testimony was unlike anything federal courts had seen before. Former inmates took the stand and described what life inside the SHU actually felt like. 23 hours a day inside a concrete box with no windows, no natural light, no human contact beyond the occasional interaction with a corrections officer delivering food through a slot in the door. Days blending into weeks, weeks blending into months, months blending into years. One former inmate described hearing his own voice echoing off the walls and not recognizing it. Another described watching his own hands shake uncontrollably for months without understanding why. A third described a complete disconnection from reality so severe that he could not remember what the outside world looked like. The testimony was devastating, but the prosecution argued that these were criminals, dangerous men, that the conditions were necessary to maintain order inside one of the most volatile prison systems in the country. Then the mental health professionals took the stand. Dr. Craig Haney from the University of California, Santa Cruz was among the first to testify. His findings were clinical, precise, and absolutely damning. According to Dr. Haney's testimony, prolonged isolation in conditions like those at PelicanBay produced a predictable pattern of psychological deterioration. Initial anxiety and hypersensitivity to stimuli progressed into depression, appetite loss, and cognitive impairment. Over extended periods, inmates developed hallucinations, paranoia, and psychotic episodes indistinguishable from serious mental illness. The state had not created a management tool. It had created a machine that manufactured mental illness. Dr. Haney testified that some inmates he evaluated had been so psychologically damaged by their time in the SHU that they would likely never fully recover. The isolation had not just broken them temporarily. It had permanently altered their capacity to function as human beings. The courtroom went silent. Judge Thelton Henderson listened carefully. For weeks, he heard testimony after testimony. Corrections officers described the violence. Mental health professionals described the psychological destruction. Former inmates described the daily reality of existing inside a concrete tomb. And through it all, one pattern emerged that the state could not deny. The SHU was not working. Gang leaders were still directing violence from inside their cells. Inmates were deteriorating psychologically at an alarming rate. The system was producing more instability, not less. And the state had no meaningful pathway for inmates to leave the SHU once they were placed there. The validation system meant that men could be held indefinitely, not for specific crimes, but for affiliation. And once inside the SHU, the gang structure became the only organizing force in their lives, making escape from both the physical isolation and the gang cycle nearly impossible. Judge Henderson spent months reviewing the evidence, listening to every side, examining the data, studying the conditions firsthand through visits to the facility. And in January 1995, he issued his ruling. The conditions inside PelicanBay Security Housing Unit violated the 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The ruling was historic. It was the first federal court decision to declare that prolonged solitary confinement under Supermax conditions constituted cruel and unusual punishment. It established legal precedent that would influence prison reform efforts across the entire country for decades to come. Judge Henderson's ruling required the California Department of Corrections to implement sweeping reforms, improve mental health screening and treatment, limitations on the length of time inmates could be held in isolation, better protocols for managing gang validation, increased oversight of conditions inside the SHU. But here is what made the ruling even more significant. Judge Henderson acknowledged something that prison administrators rarely admit publicly. He acknowledged that the system itself was broken, that isolation was not a solution to gang violence, that warehousing men in concrete boxes for years created more dangerous inmates, not fewer. The ruling didn't just criticize PelicanBay. It challenged the fundamental philosophy behind American Supermax incarceration. The California Department of Corrections appealed, fought the ruling at every level, argued that the reforms were unnecessary, that the conditions were justified by the security threat posed by gang leaders. But the legal precedent had been set, and inside PelicanBay, even as the legal battles continued through the courts, the yards remained exactly what they had always been: dangerous, violent, and unchanged, because a court ruling on paper and reality inside those concrete walls were two very different things. The reforms were coming, but they would take years to implement. And in the meantime, every single day, the steel doors kept opening. Men kept stepping into the yard, and the violence kept happening exactly as it always had. The machine didn't stop because a judge told it to. It kept running, and the men inside it kept paying the price. The hunger strike that changed everything. The court ruling changed the law, but it didn't change the yard. For years after MadridVGomez, corrections officers at PelicanBay reported the same patterns, the same violence, the same psychological deterioration, the same cycle of isolation feeding into rage, feeding back into isolation. The reforms moved slowly. Bureaucracy, legal appeals, institutional resistance. The California Department of Corrections fought every step of the way to maintain control over how the SHU operated. And while lawyers argued in courtrooms, men inside PelicanBay continued to deteriorate. By 2011, something was building inside the facility that no court ruling could contain. It started quietly. A few inmates in the SHU began refusing food. Not out of desperation, out of strategy, out of decades of accumulated frustration with a system that had offered them no other voice. The hunger strike of 2011 would become the longest and most significant prison protest in American history. It began on July 1st. Inmates across multiple California prisons simultaneously stopped eating. But the epicenter was PelicanBay, because PelicanBay was where the grievances had festered the longest, where men had been held in isolation for 15, 20, even 25 years, where the validation system had buried people alive without any meaningful process to challenge it. The demands were specific, concrete, and deeply revealing about what life inside the SHU actually meant. The inmates demanded an end to indefinite solitary confinement. They wanted the validation system reformed so that people could actually challenge their classification. They demanded individual accountability, meaning inmates should only be punished for their own specific actions, not for the actions of others in their gang. And they demanded a fair process for owning release from the SHU back into general population. These were not demands for luxury. They were demands for basic human dignity. The California Department of Corrections initially dismissed the strike, called it a manipulation tactic orchestrated by gang leaders trying to gain leverage. The state's position was clear. These were dangerous men, convicted criminals. Their complaints did not warrant the attention of the public or the government. But the strike continued. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Inmates across the California system joined. At its peak, nearly 30,000 prisoners participated in some form of protest, the largest coordinated prison strike in the history of the United States. Inside PelicanBay, the hunger strikers were moved to medical facilities where they could be monitored. Some were force-fed through nasogastric tubes inserted through their noses and down into their stomachs while they were restrained. The procedure was painful, humiliating, and it became a flashpoint for public outrage. Media attention began to grow. Journalists started asking questions the California Department of Corrections did not want to answer. How long had these men actually been in isolation? What process existed for them to challenge their placement? What were the medical consequences of years spent inside a concrete box? The answers that emerged were shocking. According to documented records, some inmates at PelicanBay had been in the SHU for over 20 years. 20 years of 23-hour isolation. 20 years without meaningful human contact. Without sunlight. Without any real hope of release. And the validation system that kept them there was virtually impossible to challenge. Once validated as a gang member, the burden of proof fell on the inmate to prove they were no longer affiliated. In an environment where gang membership was the only survival mechanism available, proving disaffiliation was nearly impossible without putting your life at risk. The hunger strike forced a conversation that California had been avoiding for decades. Public pressure mounted. Legal organizations filed new lawsuits. Politicians on both sides began speaking publicly about conditions inside the SHU. And for the first time, the California Department of Corrections was forced to defend its practices not just in court but in the court of public opinion. The strike ended in September 2013 after 57 days, the longest hunger strike in California prison history. Some inmates had gone without food for nearly 2 months. Several suffered permanent organ damage. The medical toll was severe. But something had shifted. Governor Jerry Brown's administration began acknowledging that reforms were necessary. The California legislature started holding hearings on solitary confinement conditions, and the Department of Corrections, for the first time in its history, began publicly discussing changes to the SHU system. In 2014, California announced a landmark agreement. The state would phase out long-term solitary confinement at PelicanBay and other facilities. Inmates who had been held in the SHU for extended periods would be moved into newly created rehabilitative programs. The validation system would be reformed to include meaningful review processes. It was the most significant prison reform in California history. But reforms on paper and reality inside the walls were still two very different things. Because even as the state began implementing changes on the surface, the fundamental dynamics inside PelicanBay remained. The gang structure, the violence, the culture of survival that decades of isolation had created. You cannot spend 20 years breaking men and then expect them to heal overnight. The yard at PelicanBay was changing. Slowly, painfully. But the scars that had been carved into the men who survived inside those concrete cages ran far deeper than any policy reform could reach. The hunger strike had forced California to look at what it had built, what it had done to thousands of human beings in the name of security. But looking at something and actually fixing it are two very different things. And inside PelicanBay, the yard was still there, still waiting, still dangerous. The corrections officers, caught between the walls. Everyone remembers the inmates, the court cases, the hunger strikes, the human rights violations. The headlines focused on the men locked inside the concrete boxes. And rightfully so. The suffering inside PelicanBay's security housing unit was real, documented, devastating. But there was another group of people inside those walls that almost nobody talked about. The corrections officers. Men and women who showed up every single day to one of the most psychologically brutal work environments in the entire country. Who walked corridors where violence could erupt without warning. Who carried the weight of keeping dangerous men alive inside a system that was fundamentally broken, and who was slowly being destroyed by it. PelicanBay State Prison is located in Del Norte County, one of the most remote and economically depressed regions in Northern California. The nearest major city is hours away. For the corrections officers who worked there, the prison wasn't just a workplace. It was the entire community, the entire economy, the entire identity of the region. Many of these officers had no other options. The prison was the largest employer in Del Norte County by a significant margin. Generations of families worked inside those walls. Father to son, brother to brother. It was survival for the community the same way gang membership was survival for the inmates. And just like the inmates, the corrections officers were paying a devastating psychological price. According to multiple documented accounts from former officers and investigations conducted by the California Department of Corrections, working inside the SHU created a unique form of psychological trauma. Officers spent 8, 10, 12-hour shifts inside concrete corridors where the atmosphere was constantly charged with tension, where violence could happen at any moment, where the men they were responsible for keeping alive were simultaneously the most dangerous people in the state. The stress was relentless, constant, and it never stopped following them home. Former corrections officers described a condition that psychologists would later identify as secondary traumatic stress. Symptoms included insomnia, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and difficulty maintaining relationships outside the prison walls. Some officers developed severe anxiety disorders. Others turned to alcohol and substance abuse to cope with the daily psychological assault of working inside PelicanBay. One former officer described coming home after a 12-hour shift and being unable to sit in a room without his back against the wall, unable to allow anyone to stand behind him, unable to sleep without checking the locks on every door in his house multiple times before closing his eyes. The culture inside the corrections officer community at PelicanBay was built around toughness, around not showing weakness, around maintaining control at all costs. Officers who admitted to struggling psychologically were often isolated by their peers, viewed as weak, unreliable, dangerous to have on the unit. This culture meant that officers suffering from trauma rarely sought help. They pushed through, kept working, kept carrying the weight internally until it became too heavy to bear, and the system offered them almost nothing in return. According to testimony from corrections officer union representatives, mental health support for officers at PelicanBay was severely inadequate. Employee assistance programs existed on paper, but the culture of silence meant almost nobody used them. Officers feared that seeking psychological help would damage their careers, that colleagues would view them differently, that supervisors would question their fitness for duty. The result was a workforce that was deteriorating from the inside out. Divorce rates among corrections officers at remote California prisons were significantly higher than the national average. Suicide rates within the corrections officer community nationally were documented as being among the highest of any profession. And at facilities like PelicanBay, where the conditions were more extreme than almost anywhere else in the country, the toll was even more severe. But the psychological damage wasn't the only problem. The violence that corrections officers witnessed every single day inside the SHU yards created a moral injury that went beyond stress. These were men who had sworn an oath to protect human life. And every day they watched human beings hurt each other in ways that no amount of training could fully prepare anyone for. Stabbings that happened in seconds. Beatings that left men permanently disfigured. Riots that required lethal force to stop. Officers who had to make split-second decisions about when to intervene and when intervention would make things worse. Some officers described the moment they realized the system was broken, not through any single dramatic event, but through a slow accumulation of moments that gradually eroded their belief that what they were doing made any difference. They were hired to keep men alive, to maintain order, to protect human life inside one of the most dangerous environments in the country. But the system they worked inside was designed in a way that made all of those things nearly impossible. The isolation created the psychological deterioration. The psychological deterioration fed the violence. The violence required armed response. The armed response created more trauma for everyone inside the walls, officers and inmates alike. It was a closed loop, a machine that produced suffering on both sides of the concrete. Former officers who left PelicanBay described a haunting realization that they had given years of their lives to a system that was fundamentally designed to fail, that the people who created the SHU never intended for it to work the way it actually worked, and that everyone inside those walls, corrections officers and inmates both, were paying the price for decisions made by people who never set foot inside the facility. The reforms that began after the hunger strike acknowledged the suffering of the inmates. Court rulings protected their constitutional rights. Public attention forced political action. But nobody was asking the same questions about the corrections officers. Nobody was filing lawsuits on their behalf. Nobody was holding press conferences about their deteriorating mental health. Nobody was forcing the system to acknowledge that it was destroying the people it employed just as thoroughly as it was destroying the people it housed. They were invisible, caught between the walls, serving a system that was breaking them from the inside out. And at PelicanBay, that invisible suffering continued long after the cameras left and the headlines faded. Because the prison was still there, still operating, still demanding everything from the men and women who showed up every day to walk those concrete corridors, and still offering almost nothing in return. The legacy of the cage. Today, PelicanBay State Prison still stands in Del Norte County, California. The guard towers still rise above the redwood forest. The razor wire still gleams under security lights. And the security housing unit still houses some of the most dangerous men in the California prison system. But something fundamental has changed. The reforms that began with MadridVGomez and accelerated after the hunger strikes have reshaped what the SHU actually means. The indefinite isolation that once defined PelicanBay is no longer the dominant practice. Inmates can no longer be held in solitary confinement for decades based solely on gang validation. The state has implemented step-down programs designed to move men from isolation back into general population through demonstrated behavior change. These are not small victories. They represent the largest shift in American Supermax incarceration policy in modern history. But ask the men who spent years inside those concrete boxes, and they will tell you something the reform documents never capture. The damage was already done. Todd Ashker spent nearly 28 years in the PelicanBay SHU. 28 years of isolation, of concrete walls and fluorescent lights and 60 minutes of solitary yard time per day. He was one of the lead organizers of the 2011 hunger strike, one of the voices that forced California to acknowledge what it had built. In 2015, as part of the settlement agreement following the hunger strike lawsuits, Ashker was moved out of the SHU. After nearly 3 decades of isolation, he was placed in general population. According to interviews he gave to journalists and legal advocates, the transition was devastating. He described walking into a room with other people and feeling his body physically recoil. Described conversations with other inmates where he could not process what they were saying because his brain had forgotten how to engage in normal human interaction. Described nights where he could not sleep because the presence of other people in the same building triggered panic attacks. 28 years of isolation had rewired his brain, changed how he processed stimuli, changed how he related to other human beings. The state had not just punished him. It had fundamentally altered who he was as a person. And Ashka was not alone. Thousands of men passed through the PelicanBay SHU between 1989 and the reform period beginning in 2014. Some spent a few months. Some spent years. Some spent decades. And every single one of them carried the psychological scars of that experience with them. The reforms addressed the future. They changed the policies. They limited the length of isolation. They created review processes and rehabilitative programs. But they could not undo the past. The California Department of Corrections has never formally apologized for the conditions inside PelicanBay during the early years. The state has never acknowledged that the SHU was a failed experiment in human behavior modification, and the men who survived it have received almost no meaningful support in dealing with the psychological damage that decades of isolation created. Some were released directly from the SHU into the community after serving their sentences. Men who had spent 20 years in isolation were given bus tickets and expected to reintegrate into society. The recidivism rate for these individuals was predictably catastrophic. Many returned to prison within months, not because they committed new crimes out of malice, but because they had no capacity to function in the outside world anymore. The system had broken them, released them, and then punished them again when they failed. This is the legacy that PelicanBay left behind. But there is another legacy, one that people inside the criminal justice reform movement talk about less frequently, but that might be even more significant in the long term. PelicanBay proved something that prison administrators had long denied. It proved that you cannot isolate your way to rehabilitation. The entire philosophy behind the security housing unit was based on a simple assumption. Remove the most dangerous inmates from the general population. Isolate them completely. Strip away all stimuli, and you will neutralize their ability to organize violence. The assumption was wrong. Gang leaders continued directing operations from inside the SHU. Violence continued in the yards, and the isolation itself created psychological damage that made rehabilitation nearly impossible. The system did not produce reformed individuals. It produced broken men who were more dangerous when they left than when they entered. This realization has influenced prison policy across the entire country. Multiple states have begun limiting or eliminating long-term solitary confinement in their facilities. Federal courts have increasingly ruled that extended isolation violates constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. And the broader conversation about mass incarceration in America has started to acknowledge what happened at places like PelicanBay as cautionary tales rather than success stories. The reforms are real. The policy changes are meaningful. But they came decades too late for the men who were used as test subjects in an experiment that should never have been conducted in the first place. Today, if you visit PelicanBay State Prison, you will see a facility that looks almost identical to how it looked in 1989. The same concrete structures, the same guard towers, the same razor wire perimeter. But the population has changed. The average length of stay in the SHU has decreased significantly. Inmates have access to educational programs that did not exist during the early years. Mental health screening has improved. The validation system has been reformed to include meaningful review processes. The yard is still there, still dangerous, still a place where violence can erupt in seconds. But the men who walk into that concrete cage today have something their predecessors did not have. Hope. However small, however fragile, the possibility that isolation is not permanent, that the system offers a pathway back, that survival inside the cage does not require gang membership and violence as the only organizing principles of existence. For some, that hope is enough. For others, it is too little, too late. The corrections officers who remain at PelicanBay describe a facility that is calmer than it was during the peak years of violence. The institutional culture has shifted. Training has improved. Mental health support for staff has slowly expanded, but the psychological toll remains. The officers who work through the worst years carry scars that do not heal with policy reform. And the community of Del Norte County remains economically dependent on a prison system that nearly destroyed everyone who passed through it. This is what PelicanBay State Prison represents in American corrections history. It represents the farthest extreme that isolation-based incarceration has ever reached. It represents a legal and moral reckoning with practices that violated fundamental human rights. It represents thousands of lives permanently altered by a system designed without adequate understanding of human psychology. And it represents a question that the American criminal justice system is still struggling to answer. If isolation does not work, what does? Because the men inside PelicanBay were not invented by the prison system. They were produced by it, by communities with no resources, by gang structures that offered belonging where society offered nothing, by cycles of violence and poverty that created exactly the kind of desperate, dangerous individuals that the system then had no idea how to manage. PelicanBay was not the cause. It was the symptom. And until America addresses the root causes that fill prisons with broken men in the first place, facilities like PelicanBay will continue to exist. The names might change. The specific policies might evolve. But the fundamental reality will remain. Somewhere in America, there will always be a yard. A concrete cage where desperate men fight for survival. Where violence is the only language anyone understands. Where the state exercises absolute control and achieves almost nothing except more suffering. The most dangerous yard in America was never just about PelicanBay. It was about all of us. About what we are willing to accept. What we are willing to ignore. What we are willing to call justice when we lock human beings inside concrete boxes and pretend we are making society safer. PelicanBay forced us to look at what we built. And the question is whether we learned anything from what we saw.